The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a sterile glow on the pristine white walls of the new mental health facility. It was a stark contrast to the decaying behemoth that loomed in the distance, the abandoned Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. My new job at the newly built facility was a chance for a fresh start, a chance to leave the city's clamor behind and embrace the quiet tranquility of rural West Virginia. Yet every time my gaze drifted towards the asylum, a shiver snaked down my spine. My first few weeks were uneventful. Days were filled with the usual routine of a psychiatric nurse, medication rounds, therapy sessions, and comforting patients grappling with their inner demons. But as the days bled into weeks, a subtle unease began to creep in. It started with fleeting glimpses, a shadow flitting across the periphery of my vision, a whisper of movement in the deserted hallways. I dismissed them as tricks of the light, the overactive imagination of a woman alone in a new place. One night, however, the line between the real and the imagined blurred. I was finishing up my rounds, the only sound the rhythmic squeak of my shoes on the polished floor, when I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the end of the corridor. It was shrouded in shadow, its form indistinct, yet its presence undeniable. My breath hitched in my throat, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Before I could react, it was gone, vanished into the darkness. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every creak of the building, every rustle of leaves outside my window sent my pulse racing. The shadowy figure became a recurring nightmare, appearing and disappearing with the same chilling unpredictability. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a gnawing sense of dread, I started researching the asylum's history. I unearthed tales of overcrowding, neglect, and experimental treatments that made my stomach churn. There were stories of patients disappearing, of unexplained deaths, of screams echoing through the empty halls. One name in particular caught my attention, a young woman admitted in the 1950s. Records were scant, but the few details I found painted a grim picture. She was deemed incurably insane and subjected to brutal treatments, her cries for help ignored. She eventually died within the asylum's walls, her passing shrouded in mystery. An overwhelming sense of empathy washed over me. I felt an inexplicable connection to this woman, a burning need to understand her story. Then the dreams began. Vivid, disturbing dreams of a woman with hollow eyes and tangled hair, beckoning me towards the asylum. In the dreams, she would lead me to a specific room, a room with peeling paint and a rusted iron bed. I could feel her despair, her loneliness, her desperate plea for recognition. One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, I made a decision. I would go to the asylum. The full moon hung like a spectral eye in the inky sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown grounds of the asylum. A chill wind whipped through the skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the crumbling stone walls like desperate hands. I parked my car a safe distance away, the engine's purr a comforting counterpoint to the unsettling silence that descended as soon as I turned it off. With a deep breath, I stepped out into the night, the asylum's looming silhouette a stark reminder of the horrors it held. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, a scent that clung to the back of my throat and made my stomach churn. As I approached the main entrance, the heavy oak doors groaned open as if inviting me into the maw of some monstrous beast. My flashlight beam danced across the peeling paint and crumbling plaster, illuminating the debris-strewn hallways. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the scuttling of unseen creatures and the occasional drip of water echoing through the cavernous space. I consulted the floor plan I had memorized, my finger tracing the route to the room that haunted my dreams. The third floor was shrouded in an almost palpable darkness, the air heavy with a suffocating sense of despair. My flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. I felt a cold sweat prickling my skin, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Finally, I found it. Room 302. The door hung ajar, revealing a glimpse of the rusted iron bed and the peeling paint that had become so familiar in my nightmares. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open, stepping into the room. The air was thick with dust and the faint metallic scent of blood. The bed frame was cold to the touch, the mattress long since rotted away. As I shone my light around the room, I noticed something etched into the wall. A single word, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. Forgotten. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled back against the wall, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The room seemed to be closing in on me, the walls pulsating with a malevolent energy. Then I heard it, a soft sob coming from the corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned my flashlight towards the sound. There, huddled in the shadows, was a figure. It was a woman, her hair long and tangled, her clothes ragged and dirty. She was rocking back and forth, her face buried in her hands. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. They were wide and hollow, filled with an unimaginable sadness and pain. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She reached out a hand towards me, her fingers long and skeletal. Suddenly, a loud crash from down the hall shattered the silence. The woman flinched, her eyes widening in fear. She looked back at me, her expression pleading, before vanishing into thin air. I stood there, frozen in terror, my breath caught in my throat. What had I just seen? Was it a hallucination, a figment of my overactive imagination? Or was it something more sinister, something truly supernatural? Before I could even begin to process what had happened, another sound sent a jolt of fear through me. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. Someone or something was coming. Panic seized me. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam dancing wildly in the darkness, but the batteries chose that moment to die, plunging me into absolute blackness. Blind and terrified, I scrambled back, tripping over something soft and yielding. I stifled a scream, my hand clamping over my mouth. The footsteps were getting closer, louder, echoing ominously in the suffocating silence. Driven by pure adrenaline, I groped for the door, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the handle. I wrenched it open and stumbled into the hallway, the darkness swallowing me whole. I could hear the footsteps right behind me, heavy and relentless, like the thudding of a monstrous heart. Blindly, I ran. I ran through the labyrinthine corridors, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The asylum seemed to twist and turn around me, the hallways stretching into an endless maze. I could hear the footsteps echoing behind me, gaining ground. Suddenly, I slammed into a wall, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I slid to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The footsteps stopped. A terrifying silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness just inches away. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable. But instead of the attack I expected, I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my wrist. I screamed, a primal sound that tore from my throat, and tried to pull away, but the grip was like iron. I was dragged backwards, my fingernails scraping against the rough floor. I thrashed and kicked, but it was no use. I was being pulled into the darkness, towards the source of the growl. Suddenly, I was yanked through a doorway, tumbling onto a cold stone floor. The hand released my wrist, and I scrambled back, pressing myself against the wall. My eyes, slowly adjusting to the dim light filtering through a grimy window, made out the outline of my surroundings. It was a small, cell-like room, the walls covered in crude drawings and disturbing scrawls. In the center of the room, a figure was hunched over, its back to me. It was making a low, guttural sound, like a wounded animal. As I watched in horror, the figure slowly turned. It was a man, his face contorted in a grotesque mask of pain and rage. His clothes were ragged and filthy, his skin covered in sores and scars. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They were bloodshot and wild, filled with a primal fury that made my blood run cold. He lunged at me, his hands outstretched, his mouth open in a silent scream. I flinched back, raising my arms to protect myself. But instead of the attack I expected, he collapsed at my feet, his body racked with sobs. I stared down at him, my mind reeling. Who was this man? What had happened to him? And why had he brought me here? As I cautiously approached him, I noticed something glinting in the dim light. It was a small silver locket, clutched tightly in his hand. I gently pried it open, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside the locket was a picture of a young woman with familiar hollow eyes and tangled hair. It was the woman from my dreams, the woman from room 302. And scrawled on the back of the picture, in the same dried blood I had seen on the wall, was a single word: Mother. The man's sobs echoed through the small room, a haunting melody of grief and despair. I knelt down beside him, my hand resting gently on his shoulder. He didn't resist, his body limp and lifeless. I could feel the tremors running through him, the deep-seated pain that consumed him. After a few moments, he began to speak, his voice barely audible, a whisper lost in the shadows. He spoke of his mother, a beautiful and loving woman, taken from him too soon. He spoke of his father, a cruel and abusive man who had turned his childhood into a living hell. He spoke of the asylum, a place of confinement and torture where his sanity was slowly eroded. He spoke of the experiments, the cruel and inhumane treatments that had left him scarred both physically and emotionally. And he spoke of her, the woman from room 302, his only friend in the darkness. She had been kind and gentle, a beacon of light in his otherwise bleak existence. But she had been taken from him too, leaving him alone in the abyss of his own despair. As he finished his story, I could see the tears rolling down his cheeks, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He had been trapped in this place for decades, his soul broken and shattered. But he had found a kindred spirit in her, a connection that had transcended time and space. I reached out and touched his hand, my own trembling slightly. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a question that seemed to hang in the air. I knew what he wanted to ask, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. He was asking if I could see her, if I could feel her presence. And I knew that I could. I had seen her in my dreams, I had felt her despair, her loneliness. But I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't tell him that I was afraid. Afraid of what she might do, afraid of what she might want from me. I had seen the darkness in her eyes, the same darkness that lurked in the shadows of the asylum. And I knew that if she were to find me, if she were to reach out to me, I might not be able to resist. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I had to leave, that I couldn't stay here any longer. But I couldn't leave him alone, not after what he had shared with me. "I have to go," I said, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Please don't leave me," he whispered. I hesitated, my heart torn in two. But I knew that I had to make a choice, that I had to protect myself. I reached out and touched his cheek, my fingers tracing the scars that marred his face. "I'll be back," I promised him, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his eyes closing. I watched as he drifted off to sleep, his breathing slow and even. I turned and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind me. As I made my way back to the main entrance, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that I had done the right thing, that I had helped to ease his pain. But I also knew that I would never forget him, that he would always be a part of me. And I knew that I would never forget the woman from room 302, the woman who had haunted my dreams and shattered my heart. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I took a deep breath, the crisp scent of autumn filling my lungs. The asylum stood before me, its silhouette shrouded in the moonlight. I knew that I would never return to that place, that the darkness within its walls was too much for me to handle. But I also knew that I had to find a way to move on, to find peace within myself. I had to learn to live with the ghosts of the past, to find a way to heal and move forward. And so, I took a step forward into the unknown, the future stretching out before me like a blank canvas. I knew that the journey would be long and difficult, but I also knew that I was not alone. I had the strength within me to overcome the challenges that lay ahead, to find the light in the darkness. And so I walked on, my heart filled with hope and determination. I knew that the future was uncertain, but I also knew that it was mine to shape. And with each step, I took one step closer to finding my own path, to finding my own peace. The days following my encounter in the asylum were a blur. I went through the motions at work, my mind a million miles away. The pristine white walls of the new facility seemed to mock me, a stark contrast to the decaying grandeur of the abandoned asylum. The faces of my patients swam before my eyes, their voices a distant murmur. I was haunted by the man's story, by the woman's hollow eyes, by the chilling inscription on the wall. Forgotten. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were filled with visions of the asylum, its corridors stretching into endless mazes, its rooms filled with shadows and whispers. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the echo of the man's sobs ringing in my ears. Driven by a need to understand, I delved deeper into the asylum's history. I spent hours poring over old records, newspaper clippings, and online forums. I learned about the asylum's dark past, the overcrowding, the neglect, the experimental treatments. I learned about the countless patients who had suffered and died within its walls, their stories lost to time. But it was the woman's story that continued to haunt me. I felt an inexplicable connection to her, a sense of responsibility to uncover the truth of her tragic life. I scoured the records, searching for any mention of her, any clue that might shed light on her identity and her fate. One evening, as I was leaving the library, I noticed a small antique shop tucked away in a quiet corner. Drawn by an inexplicable curiosity, I stepped inside. The shop was filled with a strange assortment of objects, from dusty old books to antique furniture. As I browsed the shelves, my eyes fell upon a familiar object, a small silver locket identical to the one I had found in the man's hand. My heart skipped a beat. I picked up the locket, my fingers tracing its delicate engravings. It felt strangely warm to the touch, as if it held a life of its own. I opened it and my breath caught in my throat. Inside the locket was a picture of a young woman with hollow eyes and tangled hair. It was her, the woman from my dreams, the woman from room 302. And scrawled on the back of the picture in faded ink was a name, Eleanor. Finally, I had a name to put to the face that had haunted my dreams, a name to connect to the soul that had touched my heart. But the discovery only deepened the mystery. Who was Eleanor? What had happened to her? And why was her spirit still trapped within the asylum's walls? I purchased the locket, clutching it tightly in my hand as I left the shop. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake off. As I walked towards my car, I noticed a figure standing across the street, watching me. It was a tall, gaunt figure, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew instinctively who it was. It was the man from the asylum. He stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on me. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but also a strange sense of recognition. It was as if he had been waiting for me, as if he had something to tell me. I started to cross the street, but he raised a hand, stopping me in my tracks. He shook his head slowly, his expression filled with sadness and warning. Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. What did it mean? Why had he stopped me? What was he trying to tell me? As I drove home, my mind raced with questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into the asylum's mystery, that I was on the verge of uncovering something truly terrifying. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that I couldn't turn back now. The locket felt heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder of Eleanor and the mystery that surrounded her. The man's warning echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition of danger. Yet I couldn't ignore the pull of the asylum, the unanswered questions that gnawed at my soul. I returned to the asylum the next night, armed with a fresh set of batteries for my flashlight and a renewed sense of determination. This time, I wasn't going to run. I was going to face whatever lurked within those walls, whatever secrets they held. I found room 302 just as I had left it, the word forgotten still scrawled on the wall in dried blood. But this time there was a difference. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the corner where Eleanor had appeared, casting an eerie light on the rusted bed frame. As I approached, the glow intensified, and a figure began to solidify within it. It was Eleanor, her image clearer than ever before. Her eyes, though still filled with sadness, held a newfound intensity, a sense of urgency. "You came back," she whispered, her voice a soft echo in the stillness. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I had to know the truth," I said. Eleanor's form wavered, her image flickering like a candle flame. "The truth is painful," she said, her voice laced with sorrow. "But it must be told." And then she began to tell her story. She spoke of her life before the asylum, a life filled with love and laughter. She spoke of her family, her friends, her dreams for the future, but her happiness was shattered when she was diagnosed with a mental illness, a condition that was then considered incurable. She was admitted to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, a place where hope went to die. She endured horrific treatments, her cries for help ignored. She witnessed unspeakable acts of cruelty, her spirit slowly crushed beneath the weight of despair. But even in the darkest of times, she found a glimmer of hope. She met a young man, a fellow patient, who shared her pain and her loneliness. They found solace in each other's company, their bond a beacon of light in the abyss of their suffering. But their happiness was short-lived. The man was deemed a danger to himself and others, and he was subjected to a brutal lobotomy that left him a shell of his former self. Eleanor watched in horror as the light faded from his eyes, his spirit extinguished. Consumed by grief and despair, Eleanor took her own life, her final act of defiance against the cruelty that had consumed her. But her spirit remained trapped within the asylum's walls, bound by the pain and suffering she had endured. As Eleanor finished her story, I felt tears streaming down my face. Her pain was palpable, her sorrow overwhelming. I reached out to her, my hand passing through her ethereal form. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Eleanor's image began to fade, her form dissolving into the surrounding darkness. "Don't be sorry for me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Be sorry for them, for all the forgotten souls who suffered within these walls." And then she was gone. I stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the sound of my own sobs. Eleanor's story had shaken me to my core, revealing the true horror of the asylum's past. But it had also given me a sense of purpose, a mission to ensure that the forgotten souls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum would never truly be forgotten. As I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small wooden door hidden in the shadows behind the bed frame. Curiosity piqued, I opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding washing over me, but I knew that I couldn't ignore this final mystery. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The stairs led to a small underground chamber. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and a chill ran down my spine. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw him. The man from the asylum. He was sitting on a stone bench, his head bowed, his body rocking back and forth. He looked up as I approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and recognition. "You came back," he whispered, his voice hoarse and raspy. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I had to understand," I said. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against my cheek. I flinched, but he didn't harm me. "She's gone," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "She's finally free." I looked at him, my mind reeling. "But how?" I asked. "How is that possible?" he smiled sadly. You freed her, he said. By listening to her story, by remembering her pain, you gave her the peace she longed for. He took a step back, his form beginning to shimmer and fade. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for remembering us, and then he was gone. I stood there in the darkness, the silence deafening. The man's words echoed in my mind, a bittersweet farewell. I had come to the asylum seeking answers, but I had found something far more profound. I had found a connection to the forgotten souls who had suffered within its walls, a connection that transcended time and space. As I made my way back up the stairs, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that Eleanor and the man were finally at rest, their spirits freed from the darkness that had consumed them. And I knew that their stories would live on, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. I left the asylum that night, the weight of its history lifted from my shoulders. The abandoned building still stood, a silent monument to the past, but it no longer held the same power over me. I had faced my fears, uncovered the truth, and found a way to heal. And as I drove away, I glanced back at the asylum one last time. In the moonlight, I could have sworn I saw a faint glow emanating from room 302, a final farewell from the woman who had touched my heart and changed my life forever. But as I looked closer, I realized the glow was coming from something else. It was coming from the new mental health facility, its windows shining brightly in the darkness. And in that moment, I knew that the legacy of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum would live on, not in the shadows of the past, but in the hope and healing that the new facility offered to those who still suffered. The final twist, the chilling revelation that would make your skin crawl, was this. As I drove away, I reached up to adjust my rearview mirror, and in the reflection, I saw her, Eleanor. She was sitting in the back seat, her eyes hollow, her expression filled with a chilling sadness. And as I turned to face her, she smiled. A slow, sinister smile that sent shivers down my spine and made me realize that the asylum's darkness had not been left behind. It had followed me home.